Deaths in Glenmorach Manor, a fiction novel. Written by Shirley, read by Sir Lawrence Olivier. This audiobook was narrated using synthetic voice technology provided by 11 Labs. Chapter 15. It was a week after Benjamin's death. When the hour was late, moonlight slipped through the heavy curtains, casting eerie shadows along the grand hallways of the manor. I had just begun to settle into bed when the sharp ring of the housekeeper's bell shattered the silence. This wasn't the usual request for a glass of water or a missing item. Something felt different. I hurried out of bed, pulled on my overcoat, and rushed to Robert Wallace's bedroom, where everyone had already gathered. As I arrived at the door, I could already hear the commotion inside, the muffled sounds of frantic sobs and hushed voices. It was a grim symphony. I pushed open the door to witness a scene that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Robert Wallace was sitting on the edge of his bed, holding the lifeless body of Rosie Taylor, his father's caregiver, in his arms. His sobs were guttural, raw, like the cries of a man who had lost not only a lover, but perhaps his last tether to sanity. Lord Wallace's voice cracked from behind me, sharp with panic. "Oh, my God! Robert!" His frail, wheelchair-bound form was accompanied by his youngest daughter, Lady Eleanor, who looked as though she might collapse from the sheer horror of it all. John stood nearby, his face a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. Mr. Morrison stood in the corner, his face ashen. I stepped forward, my professional detachment slowly taking over as I assessed the scene. Robert's hands were trembling as he clutched Rosie's cold, pale body to him. His voice broke as he cried and whispered her name again and again. "Rosie. Oh, God, no. Rosie." Lady Eleanor whispered softly, her gaze fixed on the dead woman. "Someone must have done this. But who?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. "Get her away from him," Lord Wallace commanded, though his voice held no authority, only despair. He was shaken, barely able to believe that within the span of 4 days, 2 people close to him had been taken from this world. I moved to the bedside, kneeling next to the young woman's body, my mind racing through the details. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the lamp on the nightstand. The first thing I noticed was the absence of any clear wound. No dagger, no sign of a violent attack like Benjamin had suffered. Rosie's body lay unmarked, save for a smudge of blood beneath her right fingernails. Using a scrap of fabric I found near the bed, I carefully lifted her hand, inspecting her fingernails closely. Traces of blood and some hair fragments were found under those fingernails. Those nails were cracked, as though they had been used to scrape something or someone desperately in an attempt to defend herself. As I delicately extracted pieces of dark, dirty blonde hair wedged into the cracks of her fingernails, I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. "Look here." She fought back. Morrison asked me anxiously, his voice full of uncertainty. "Fought back? Who would she be fighting?" I answered while my eyes scanning the rest of the room. "Whoever did this." There was a sign of forced entry into the room. The latch on the window was broken, and the catch was bent at an odd angle. It appeared to have been tampered with from the outside. A break-in. I stood up and took in the rest of the room. Everything seemed oddly calm. Too calm for someone who had been murdered in her sleep. Or worse, in her final moments of struggle. But something was wrong. The atmosphere of the room became very strange, as though it were charged with terrible energy. I approached. I saw a jug of water on top of the nightstand, next to the bed. I bent on my knee to look under the bed. A small bottle rolled beneath the bed. I reached out, trying to grasp it. It was a vial, small and glass, containing what I assumed was poison. The liquid inside seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and the smell was faint but unmistakable. It was a noxious, bitter scent. Seems like a bottle of poison. I muttered, holding it up for everyone to see. Poison? Robert's voice cracked. No, not Rosie. Why would someone want to poison her? Calm yourself, Robert, John interjected. We need to figure out what happened if this is what actually killed her. I glanced at the floor, noting a trail of blood leading out of the balcony doors. They were enough to raise questions. Someone was bleeding, and they had been outside. I stepped toward the balcony door and opened it, my gaze drawn to the area below the balcony. I saw a large barbed wire fence stretching from the top down into the ground. The thorns on the fence were quite long and sharp. If someone got caught on it, they would undoubtedly suffer deep wounds. Mr. Morrison, I called out, turning towards the butler. Did you hear anything unusual tonight? I think I did, sir, he said, his face pale. I reckon it was about half an hour ago. I thought I heard something. A noise. Like something breaking outside. It could have been the flower pot. Or maybe something else. I could just make out a glint in the moonlight. And I decided to go out and check the garden area beneath Robert's balcony to get a clearer view of what was happening there, and to search for anything that could serve as evidence. As I expected, a torn piece of blood-stained fabric was entangled in the climbing plant wires that ran up the stone wall. Nearby, I saw a broken flower pot lay scattered across the stone ground, shards of terracotta mixing with the dirt. I nodded, placing the fabric and the broken flower pot into my evidence bag. That's more than we've had so far, I muttered under my breath. I walked back into Robert's room and began to collect the final pieces of evidence. Something about the scene still didn't sit right with me. Rosie Taylor had fought, yes, but the poison was a curveball, an unexpected variable in what seemed to be a tragic chain of events. The murder of Benjamin Wallace had already set a dark tone in the house. But now, with Rosie's death, there were far too many unanswered questions. I stood up, turning to face the others. We'll get to the bottom of this. I will find out who is responsible for Rosie's death, I said, my voice hard and resolute. Lady Eleanor's gaze met mine. Please, Mr. Owen, make sure the truth comes out for all our sakes. I nodded once more, sealing the evidence bags with the quiet finality of a man who knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The chill of the night had set deep in the walls of the manor, but inside Robert's room, I could feel the heat of urgency pressing down on me as I sifted through the evidence. It was all too bizarre, too sudden, 2 murders in a matter of days. But now, as I pieced together the facts, something about this second death was starting to feel strange. I stepped back from Rosie's body, considering the details in front of me, trying to analyze and make sense of it all. I had already examined the clues. The broken window latch was indicating a break-in. Then the trail of dripping blood spots leading out to the balcony and the torn fabric with bloodstains entangled on the barbed wire were indicating the murderer was someone from outside the manor, and he was wounded. Furthermore, some hair fragments and somewhat dried bloodstains discovered beneath Rosie's broken fingernails were obvious signs of struggle. But it was clear to me that the killer didn't use a knife or a blunt object. There were no signs of stabbing or beating. No. The cause of death had been far more subtle. When I examined Rosie's body more closely, I noted the faint but unmistakable marks around her nose and cheeks. The murderer seemed to have pressed something soft over her face to stop her breathing, likely a pillow. The lack of struggle in that area made it clear. She had been caught off guard. What unsettled me the most was the small bottle of poison rolled under the bed. Who was the poison intended for? And why Rosie? It didn't make sense. The crime had taken place in Robert's bedroom in the middle of the night. I assumed she wasn't the intended victim. Not really. The killer hadn't been after her. No, they were after Robert. It hit me like a jolt of electricity. The murderer must have thought whoever slept under the blanket was Robert Wallace. Perhaps they had planned to finish what they had started, take out the second son of Lord Wallace. Robert, who was the heir apparent to the Wallace following Benjamin's death, would have been the obvious next target. But in their panic, the killer had miscalculated. Rosie was, in fact, the one sleeping on Robert's bed. Not Robert himself. She had probably stirred awake when the murderer entered, and in that moment of confusion, she was the one to pay the price. My mind was working furiously, piecing together the timeline. Rosie had been in Robert's room for some time, perhaps taking a nap before going to sleep in her own bedroom, or maybe she was waiting for him to return. My theory? She had been half asleep when the killer made their move. She must have heard something, footsteps, a rustle, and opened her eyes to find a figure in the room. I could imagine it now. The look of panic on Rosie's face as she realized the danger she was in. The desperate instinct to fight back, to scream. But she couldn't. Something had made her weak, and I suspected that she was half asleep. My second theory, something was enough to make Rosie lightheaded and drowsy. Perhaps she consumed something earlier that had clouded her mind and made her sluggish. That was why she didn't put up a stronger fight. And when she scratched the killer, her movements were sluggish, and she was not capable to escape. Rosie recognized the killer. I was quite sure of it. Because, despite being injured and bleeding, the killer refused to flee and ended the girl's life instead. Everything was done to make sure that she wouldn't say a word to anyone about who attacked her that night. The pieces were beginning to come together, and it was as if the full picture was slowly being revealed to me. The killer had planned this meticulously, thinking they were removing the young heir. They came prepared with poison, and when their plan went awry, they'd have to improvise. The pillow had been a last-minute measure. No time to take out a dagger. No time for anything but a quick, silent execution. The only problem now was the question that had been gnawing at me ever since I first stepped foot in this house. Who was the killer? I stood in the room, mulling over my findings. There was a possibility that the killer was someone close to Robert, or at least had a strong motive to kill him. Someone who was familiar with the precise location of Robert's bedroom and knew exactly how to access it from the garden. I glanced over at Robert. He was still sitting by Rosie's side, lost in his grief. His face was streaked with tears, his body trembling. It would be easy to suspect him, wouldn't it? He had been the one closest to Rosie after all. His emotional turmoil could easily be interpreted as guilt, and his proximity to the crime scene was too convenient to ignore. But something about his reaction struck me as genuine. Desperation, yes, but not guilt. I turned to the others in the room, none of whom seemed to have any answers. I didn't see Lady Lucy and Anthony among the others, but with the huge size of this manor, the location of the East Wing Pavilion was quite a distance to hear such a commotion from the main building in the middle of the night, when everyone was expected to be in a deep sleep. I just kept their absence in my mind. We need to get the answers now. I'll need everyone to stay put while I investigate further, I said, my voice breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Lady Eleanor opened her mouth, likely to protest, but her father, Lord Wallace, cut her off with a soft, defeated sigh. Do what you must, Mr. Owen. We can't stand here and do nothing. We're already losing everyone we care about. I don't want to lose Robert, too. It was clear that the man was at the end of his strength. The tragedies that had unfolded in such a short period had shattered him, but he was still holding on to the hope that the truth would come to light. I turned toward the door, motioning for the others to follow. As I began my search, another thought lingered in my mind. Rosie had been the unintended victim of a killer's panic, and I was beginning to think that whoever was behind this murder, this series of deaths, had been very, very careful. Too careful. They made sure to leave as few traces as possible, but they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated me, and I would find them, no matter the cost. Part 2. The room was cold now, the weight of what had transpired settling heavily in the atmosphere. Robert had been sitting quietly by Rosie's body, his face buried in his hands, his tears still fresh on his cheeks. The sight of him, so broken, made me hesitate for a moment. How could I question a man who had just lost someone he obviously cared for so deeply? But I had a duty to perform. There were too many unanswered questions, And Robert, as the only one found with the body, was the key to unraveling this. His grief, no matter how genuine, couldn't exempt him from scrutiny. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to remain composed. Robert, I need to ask you a few questions. I know this is difficult, but I need you to answer truthfully. He looked up at me through his teary eyes, his voice heavy with emotion. Of course, Mr. Owen, you must think I'm a monster, but I swear I didn't do this. I would never harm Rosie. I said softly, trying to reassure him. I don't think you're a monster, though I was not sure what I believed yet. But I do need to understand what happened here tonight. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, and his voice cracked. I was with Rosie earlier this evening after 10 p.m. when my father had already retired to his room. The house was quiet. We were alone in my study. She had been helping me with some paperwork for my father, just small things, you know. But after that, we had some drinks. Drinks? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. What kind of drinks? Robert paused, swallowing hard. Just a little whiskey. Nothing excessive, just enough to unwind. She seemed tired, so I suggested she take a rest. He looked away as though ashamed. I didn't want her to be on her feet all night after working so hard. So, you asked her to lie down on your bed? I pressed, my gaze steady on him. Robert admitted, his voice growing quieter. Yes, she said she only needed to close her eyes and relax for a while. I didn't think she'd be out for long, but he fell asleep quickly. I left her in my bed and went downstairs to the kitchen to make her and myself 2 cups of tea. I thought it might help with the headache she'd mentioned earlier. And when did you return? I asked. Robert's eyes drifted back to Rosie's body, his face crumpling again as the memories seemed to hit him with full force. I came back about half an hour later. It was just after midnight, maybe closer to 1. The house was so still. I opened the door quietly, not wanting to wake her. But when I walked in, I thought she was just sleeping. She looked so peaceful, lying there. And I didn't think anything was wrong. I thought maybe she had just fallen asleep quickly from the drink, and I gently shook her, calling her name. And when did you realize she was dead? I asked, keeping my voice even. A shudder ran through Robert's body, and he closed his eyes tightly as though trying to block out the image. At first, I couldn't. I just thought she was in deep sleep. But when I shook her again, her body was cold. There was no response. That's when it hit me. I tried to wake her up, I swear, but there was nothing. I was in shock. I didn't know what to think. I don't know how long I was there, just staring at her. I couldn't believe it. I never thought it would be like this. I didn't even see it coming. He was shaking, his voice ragged with grief. I loved her, Mr. Owen. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want her to die. I let the silence hang between us for a moment, watching Robert carefully. His words were desperate, and there was no denying the anguish in his eyes. But as I listened to his account, my mind began to mix with new possibilities. The bottle of poison found under Robert's bed was still fresh in my mind, and I had no doubt it had been part of the equation here. If she had been drinking earlier, that could explain why she had been so weak, and why she hadn't been able to defend herself. But why hadn't Robert noticed the signs of poison earlier? If they had shared drinks, shouldn't he have noticed something unusual about her behavior? My mind raced, piecing together the threads. Rosie's sudden death, the bottle of poison I'd found tipped over beneath the bed, and the cup of hot tea Robert had brought up for her from the kitchen. But as I studied her lifeless body, something didn't sit right. There were no signs she'd been poisoned, nothing to suggest she'd swallowed anything fatal. I continued, keeping my tone measured. And when you left her to go downstairs for the tea, how was she? Did she seem entirely herself? Robert seemed to think hard for a moment. She was a little flushed, but not in a bad way. She seemed all right. Just tired, I suppose. I didn't think anything was wrong. Did she even have a chance to get a sip of the hot tea that you made earlier? I asked him again, trying to connect the dots. No, Mr. Owen. She was in deep sleep when I got back in my room, Robert answered. But I saw the half-empty cuppa. I pressed him with my question. Robert's eyes widened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of confusion. That half-empty cup was mine, Mr. Owen. The other full cup was prepared for her, but she didn't get a chance to drink from it. I stood up, the weight of what he had said sinking in. It was becoming clearer, though there were still so many unanswered questions. Robert had been drinking too, and he hadn't seemed concerned about anything wrong with Rosie when he left her in bed. The poison, whether it was in the drinks or the tea, was now a possibility I could no longer ignore. If Rosie had indeed been drugged, then Robert might have been unaware of her deteriorating condition until it was too late. But why would the killer choose her as the target if it had been Robert they were after? And then there was the small bottle of poison I had found earlier, which still puzzled me. Someone had come prepared. But what if it hadn't been just about getting rid of Robert? I let my questions hang in the air as I took a step back, scanning Robert's face once more. Robert, I need you to stay in the manor while I continue my investigation. And please, think carefully. If there's anything else you can recall, any small detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem, it could be the key to understanding who did this. He nodded. His face was pale. I will, Mr. Owen, I will. Just, please, find out who did this to her. I will, I assured him. As soon as I finished talking with Robert, suddenly the authorities arrived at Glenmorach Manor. The weight of the night settled around me as I stood in the hallway, watching the authorities enter Robert's bedroom to remove Rosie's lifeless body and scanning the surrounding area. It wasn't how I'd imagined the investigation unfolding. Having to watch a man, one I'd just questioned and whose grief seemed genuine, be taken away in shackles. But the law had a way of following its own rules. And in this case, those rules dictated that Robert was the only one seen in the room with the victim. He was the one who needed to be questioned more thoroughly. Lord Wallace had informed the authorities that I was in charge of investigating the murder of Benjamin Wallace, and now he wanted me to thoroughly investigate the murder of Rosie Taylor as well. He believed that the two tragedies were connected, and his instinct as a father told him that something was threatening the life of his second son, Robert Wallace, the current heir apparent to the Wallace. But the authorities didn't let me interfere their decisions, nor could I expect them to. Their job was to follow procedures. And tonight, that meant they had to arrest Robert for the murder of Rosie Taylor. I sighed deeply, rubbing my eyes. I wanted to feel certain about what had happened, but I was still too far for truth. Something was off, and I had to find it. I turned as I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me, and there stood Lady Eleanor, assisting Lord Wallace with his wheelchair. His face was a mask of despair as he watched Robert being led away by two officers. Lord Wallace's voice trembled. Mr. Owen, is this truly happening? Is my son really being arrested? I'm afraid it is, my lord. Robert was the last person seen with Rosie. The authorities have to do their part, as difficult as it is, I said, my voice firm but sympathetic. Lord Wallace let out a strangled sob, his body shaking with the weight of the tragedy. But he didn't do it, Mr. Owen. He couldn't have hurt her. He never hurt anybody. Please, you have to do something. He's my son. I can't lose him too. I said softly, stepping closer to him. I understand, my lord. The investigation is far from over, and I will continue looking for answers. I'm not convinced Robert is the killer. But the authorities must take him in for further questioning, and they'll decide on the next steps after that. I'll be working on this, and I'll make sure he's treated fairly. Lord Wallace's teary eyes met mine. A flicker of hope lighting up briefly. You're the only one who can help him now, Mr. Owen. You've got to find out the truth, please? I nodded, giving him a reassuring look before turning back to watch as Robert was escorted from the room. His face, pale and tear-streaked, was a painful image of helplessness. The officer's hands on his arms were firm, but they were not rough. They understood the gravity of the situation, too. They were just doing their job. Against protocol, but unable to let the matter rest, I insisted on accompanying Robert to the station. If Robert was innocent, and something in my gut told me he was, then the real killer was still out there, and I intended to find them. As dawn broke in the cold stone walls of the local jail, Robert was locked in a small holding cell, his eyes red from crying. He hadn't spoken much on the way over, but the authorities had made it clear he was only being detained for further questioning. Still, the weight of the situation was too much for him. I was there to witness him being processed and placed in his cell, but I wasn't allowed to speak with him until the interrogation began. I wasn't a solicitor, after all, but I waited just beyond the frosted glass. My arms crossed, listening closely for any raised voices. My job now was to observe, take notes, and look for cracks in the police's assumptions, in the timeline, and in Robert's recollection of the night. I could only hope that whatever answers came out of this wouldn't point to him as the murderer, because something told me that if I didn't act fast, there wouldn't be a way to save him from whatever dark fate awaited. After the initial questioning of Robert, I was called to meet with the authorities, this time with Detective Inspector Calloway, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense man who had been brought in to handle the investigation. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the weight of Robert's arrest hanging heavy over us. Inspector Calloway said, "We've questioned him, Mr. Owen, and I must say the lad's story doesn't add up. He claims he was downstairs making tea for himself and the victim, yet there was a half-empty cup of tea and a full cup. He says the full cup was prepared for the victim, and he had the half-empty one earlier. We still can't be sure who had the half-empty cup. Even though this raises suspicions, we'll check if the tea was contaminated, and we will also take some blood samples from Miss Taylor's dead body. Otherwise, Robert could still be considered the prime suspect." "I still don't think Robert was the murderer, Inspector. There are many inconsistencies I have found that do not support the theory that Robert is the murderer behind Miss Taylor's death," I added. Calloway replied sharply. "He was the only one with her, Mr. Owen. And the poison, the struggle, it all leads back to him. Unless you've got something else to share, we're going to need him to stay in custody for a while." I shook my head. "Thank you, Inspector. I'm looking forward to hearing the news from the autopsy report." I stood silently as the detective walked out, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. It was clear that the authorities had made up their minds about Robert, but I wasn't ready to give up on him. Not yet. Then I returned to Glenmorach Manor, where the atmosphere was full of tension. Lady Eleanor was pacing the hallway, her face drawn with worry, while Mr. Morrison hovered nearby, looking just as uncertain as the rest of us. Lord Wallace, however, was inconsolable. He was sitting in his study, slumped in his wheelchair, his hands trembling, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't know what to do, Mr. Owen. How could this be happening to my family? First Benjamin, now Robert, and then Rosie. I can't bear it." "I know, my lord," I replied quietly, my heart heavy for him. "I'm doing everything I can to find the truth, but we must remain patient. There's more to this than meets the eye." His gaze shifted from me to outside the window. His eyes seemed lost. "Do you think Robert is guilty, Mr. Owen? Or do you believe in him?" "I want to believe in him, my lord. But we have to wait until we receive the news from the autopsy and toxicology reports. That would be the only way to prove Robert's innocent." My eyes meeting his in earnest. "But I will not stop until I find out who did this. Whoever the killer is, they're still among us, and I promise you, I will uncover the truth," I said, reassuring him. Lord Wallace wiped his eyes with his trembling hand, his voice breaking once more. "Please, Ernest, bring my son back to me. I've already lost so much. I nodded, turning toward the door with a heavy heart. I will, my lord. I will. As I stepped out into the cold air, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all being drawn deeper into a web of lies and deception. And the killer was still out there, watching, waiting. I had to find them before they struck again.